right, speaking of history, we have some history to get through today. So we're actually changing subjects a little bit. We're moving on to conversations about the Bible, right? And one of the main things that people like to attack in terms of challenging our worldview is the Bible itself, right? They like to try to poke holes in its credibility, and we're just going to kind of dive into some of those ways that they try to do that in order to see if they have any kind of veracity or truth. So we're not going to do that because I will never finish. How are the books of the Bible selected? Anyone have a general idea? You can feel free to raise your hand. If you don't know, you don't know. I didn't know. So,
No, it's not Nicaea.
I feel it. Well, so the one that I have in here is Hippo. No one knows about Hippo. Even Paul was like, "What's the council?" I think it's Carthage is the one where that usually people think of what's that?
Augustine of Hippo converted later as an adult, but I didn't know he was a part of thinking the books of the Bible.
I don't know if it's him. It's the yeah. So I guess it might have been his. Actually, I don't. I had to look closer at the actual council itself to find out if it's tied to him. But we'll get to that in a little bit. So, how are the books of the Bible selected? So here's the skeptical view of the canon. So the canon just is not a thing that blows cannonballs. It's the it's the books of the Bible. And so it's the actual standard that we have. Those 27 books that we have in our New Testament. That's also referred to as the canon. And so this is kind of the way that it's portrayed in certain skeptical circles, right? They'll say that at first there were many rival versions of Christianity. So you had Thomas saying one thing, Philip saying another, Matthew saying another, John saying another. And then over time, based on who got in power, they kind of promoted their view of Christianity and suppressed the others. And then finally, 300 years later, at the Council of Hippo or Carthage, or at least the one in this book said the Council of Hippo, they ratified it into the 27 books that we have today in our Bible, right? And so we're going, and actually that 300 years is accurate. It's 393 that happened. So when you have John dying around that time, so between the death of the last apostle and when it finally gets ratified, it's about 300 years. So. So we're going to actually try to discern whether this is actually at all true. Is there any validity to this at all? Is there evidence for it? And so there's 4 ways that the early church fathers categorized the early Christian books. And so they had books that were accepted by everyone, books that were accepted by most people, books that were accepted by just a few, and then books that were rejected by everyone. And based on this kind of categorization, they decided, well, which books are we actually going to keep into the canon itself? So let's look at the early acceptance of the apostles. So we can actually go all the way back to the apostles and see them already affirming certain scriptures as being authoritative, which is kind of cool. I didn't actually realize this until I read this book. So 1 Timothy 5:18, Paul identifies a fragment of Luke's writing as scripture, and I mean he doesn't actually name Luke in this process. Luke actually does get named in, well, I guess it would be him talking about himself in the book of Acts, but Paul actually does refer to him even in some of his letters. But what he's doing here is he's actually referring to some of Luke's writing as being scriptural. So here's what it says, just in 1 Timothy 5:18. It says that. Do not muzzle an ox while it is treading out the grain, which is actually a reference to Deuteronomy. But then he tacks onto that, and the worker deserves his wages, which is a direct reference to Luke 10:7, I believe, is the scripture that's referring to. So we have Paul identifying Luke's scriptural writing as being authoritative. And so that's kind of cool, because we're not actually relying on someone that's beyond the apostles to then affirm the truth of the New Testament writings. We actually have connections between the apostles themselves. That's pretty neat. And then we also have another example of that in Peter, right? So 2 Peter 3:15 through 16, Peter's referencing Paul's letters as scripture. And he actually does name Paul in this process. He says that Paul's letters contain some things that are hard to understand, which ignorant and unstable people distort. So as they do the other scriptures to their own destruction. So he actually refers to Paul's writing as being scriptural in that verse right there. So this is kind of important, right? Because it's just help building our case. We have, interconnections in between the apostles, affirming each other as their writing being authoritative and inspired. So that's kind of a neat thing. Also, we have other New Testament writings that were being circulated at the time of the apostles, meaning widely circulated. So this is kind of an indicator that something had authority, right? So if you know something is blatantly heretical, it's not going to get circulated because people are going to know, right? The apostles are going to say this is not true, that's not from me, and it's not going to go anywhere. But we have Paul here in Colossians 4:16 saying that after this letter has been read to you, see that it is also read to the church of the Laodiceans. So we have circulation of Colossians going on. We also have circulations of Revelation going on. Some of you might remember that Revelation begins, write a scroll on what you see and send it to the 7 churches, to Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea. So we have Revelation, is being circulated at least to those 7 churches at that time, which obviously it went much further than that because we still have it today. So it didn't only go to those churches. So really where we have the bulk of our evidence, though, is from the early acceptance of the church fathers, which we briefly discussed some of those church fathers a couple weeks ago. But they're really the church leaders who lived right after or had contact with the apostles. So we're only one time removed from the apostles at this point. And that would include Clement of Rome, so he was a disciple of Peter, Ignatius of Antioch, and Polycarp of Smyrna, which were both disciples of John. And they both wrote pretty prolifically about the Gospels, or about the New Testament books, right? So they alluded to nearly all New Testament books in their writings. And what this does is it affirms that they had some level of authority. You're not going to refer to 1 Peter if you don't think it has any bearing on how you should live your life. You're not going to refer to the Gospels if you don't think that they're actually authoritative. And so they didn't have a list at this time, right? They wouldn't look at some list. Well, we know this one's authoritative. We know that one's authoritative. They just had they just referenced to certain books as being authoritative. That list will come about. You'll see in the I think it's the next slide, right? Any questions so far? Make sense? Cool. So then we have the emergence of heresies, right? And so this is because of these heresies that come about, the church fathers need to start to define which writings were authoritative and which ones weren't, so that they could say, well, we have this doctrine that's coming about in this group of people, and we have to discern, is this actually from one of us? And so they had to discern which ones do we definitively know came from the apostles, so that we can compare it to these heretical writings that are coming out. And so one of them was Marcion, right? So Marcion, he rejected the Old Testament. He said it had no value at all. It has no bearing on the New Testament writings. And of course, the New Testament writings are an outgrowth of the Old Testament. The way that you kind of fully understand what's going on in the New Testament is through the Old Testament, right? That's what gives it context and depth. And you see how Jesus is the fulfillment of the Old Testament, right? He doesn't say that he's completely changing the Old Testament; he's fulfilling it. So the Old Testament is not null and void. But that was his approach, was that it was null and void. And he also denied that Jesus came in the flesh. And this is a theme that you'll see throughout a lot of these heresies, particularly with Gnosticism, which is the next one, is that they had a hard time rationalizing Jesus' humanity, right? And they would try to say that he really wasn't human. He might have appeared to be human, but he was really just spirit, right? And that's kind of what these heresies were trying to promote at this time. And so Gnosticism believed that only spirit and soul are good, right? So and it wasn't just that. It also they also kind of believed that you had to have special knowledge for salvation. It wasn't just simple belief in Jesus. It was you had to have him revealed to you in some mystical way, and through that process, you could then be saved. Of course, none of the apostles ever said that. Jesus never said that, based on what we know of Jesus. And a lot of these people that were writing these Gnostic writings at this time were never even complaining apostolic succession, right? They weren't complaining contending that their writing actually came from an apostle. They would say that this was revealed to me, right? So, which is how you were saved, right? So this was revealed to me, and therefore you should believe me. And of course, we have the authentic writings of the apostles, and so, but why should we believe you when we have the people that actually talked to Jesus and knew Jesus and walked with him? And that was what the church fathers did to really discredit them. So, which is that last little part right there. And actually, forms of Gnosticism still exist today. Can anyone think of some Gnostic examples that might exist today?
Be like New Age stuff.
Yes. Yeah, occulty type things, right? Crystals. Even someone that really emphasizes. What's that? Yes, right. When they say spiritual, not religious, like that thing. Because we are spiritual people, right? But they like to draw that distinction. But even like when you put this like heavy emphasis on something like meditation, you'll see like certain circles in like in yoga circles will put such a heavy emphasis on meditation where like they will literally forego eating, for months and months and months, or however long that you can survive that way, I guess. And they will actually emaciate themselves because of this emphasis on spirit versus body, right? The body is not important. What's important is that you immerse yourself in Brahman or the void or spirit, and they actually have Gnostic roots, a lot of them. So yeah, Gnosticism is very alive and well today, especially in the occult. Shaping the canon. So let's kind of this claim that the canon was shaped out of political reasons. Well, let's kind of dive into that. Like, what is the evidence for that? Is there evidence against that? So we're going to kind of look at that a little bit. So kind of like I said, between the 2nd and 4th centuries, there was a lot of debate about which books were considered authoritative, and this is really an outcropping of the need to kind of put out some of these Gnostic writings, right? So because of that, we needed to define what's authoritative, and then this kind of debate arose, between the 2nd and 4th centuries to actually define that. And here's the first one that we have. So this is going pretty darn close, right? We have AD 180. We actually have this today with the Muratorian Fragment, which is an anonymous document that recognizes 22 out of the 27 writings of our New Testament. The only ones that are not in there are Hebrews, James, 1st, 2nd Peter, and 3rd John, but the rest of them are included as being recognized as authoritative. So we're not even a full 100 years out from the death of the last apostle at this point, and we have this in our archives today. It blows my mind. But so that actually gives a lot of weight to the idea that from very early on, this wasn't something that someone concocted in 393 AD. This is going back to 180. Most of them are in there, all right? And there's actually, what we're going to find out, is they had some reasons for maybe why they didn't include Hebrews, James, 1st, 2nd Peter, and 3rd John. So we'll discuss those too. So then we have Irenaeus, who's around the same time, 180. He affirms pretty much all of them. He adds one. So he adds 1 Peter that he considers to be authoritative. Okay, so we have back to 180 AD. We have all but 4 books now that are accepted into the New Testament canon. Irenaeus, is a bishop and student of Polycarp. Polycarp is a student of John. So that's the succession there. Okay, so then we have, let's keep going. So we have Tertullian, right, in AD 207. And he was an early apologist, which just means defender of the faith, right, who acknowledged that the 4 Gospels were written by the apostles or their associates. So that's how we kind of get that. I'm not exactly sure if he's the church father that is the earliest to define it, but that's actually how we find it. It's from the church fathers that we know that Matthew wrote Matthew, because it doesn't actually, if anyone remembers, the Gospel of Matthew doesn't say this is the Gospel of Matthew. Actually, none of the Gospels do that. But the way that we know that they came from who they came from was from these early church fathers who knew these apostles, right? And they said that's how we know that Mark is Luke's account, right? So not Luke's account, Peter's account. So Mark wrote Peter's account. Luke was the one that kind of compiled all the disciples' account plus Paul, and that's how we get his gospel and the book of Acts. And then that's also how we affirm that John came from the Apostle John and Matthew came from the Apostle Matthew. So that's Tertullian, and he accepted all except Second Peter, James, and 2nd and 3rd John. So there's like this variation here. So now 2nd and 3rd John is not accepted. And again, we're gonna find out like why some people or some church fathers didn't accept certain books. But you'll notice that there's some constants in there. Like 2nd Peter was giving people a lot of trouble. James is a constant, right? And 3rd John is a constant. You'll notice that Hebrews is in there too a little bit. So then we have Origen. This name always used to throw me for a loop because it just sounds like a word, not a name, but it's a name. It's a guy's name. He's also from around the same time as Tertullian. He's a theologian who categorized books as widely accepted, disputed by some, and rejected by also, kind of like the system that we're going through today. He only doesn't include one. He doesn't those accepted by most. That's the only one those rejected by those. Yeah, I think it's the 3rd one. So those accepted by a few is the one that he doesn't seem to include. But these are the ways that he categorized it. So widely accepted were the 4 Gospels. So those were not disputed really by anyone at this time. Acts was not disputed. None of Paul's letters. So that's I think 13 of those. And then we have 1 Peter's not rejected by anyone. 1 John's not rejected by anyone. Neither is Revelation. Okay, going back to the very early 3rd century. So 210 AD approximately. And the ones that were disputed were Hebrews, James, 2 Peter, 2nd and 3rd John, and Jude, okay? And we're going to discuss in a little bit why some of these were disputed. And then we also have Athanasius. So we're going to jump forward maybe about 50 years at this point. 150 years at this point. AD 367. And he was the most prominent theologian of the 4th century who finally recognized the whole canon, so all 27 books, as being authoritative. And at this point, we're only about 30 years out from when they were ratified in the Council of Hippo. So let's... I couldn't help myself. So Council of Hippo formally ratified 27 books in the New Testament canon. We'll talk about that. And what's just notable, when people say that this was, concocted by some politician in the 4th century AD, I mean, you can just comfortably say, well, 20 out of the 27 writings were accepted from the very beginning, from the earliest church fathers who knew the apostles. So, and that kind of really just can cut that down right from the get-go, because there are very good there are good reasons as to why some people had doubts about some of these books. Not that we have any reason to doubt them because of their wide acceptance, but I'm just going to tell you why they had some reservations. Certain church fathers had some reservations about some of these books. So let's talk about it. So Hebrews, author was unknown. And there were some concerns of authority. Now, these were just some people that had concerns about this. Like, when any of these books that we're talking about, most people agreed that they were authoritative. It's just a few people that were maybe a little skeptical. They just didn't seem to know. And so the reason why the reason why today we accept them as being authoritative is because they were widely accepted as being authoritative, even though we might not know something about its origin. And in Hebrews, the author's unknown. You might have heard that. Some people say it's Apollos, some people say it's Paul. But Paul, for the longest time, I think, was accepted to be the writer of Hebrews. He makes a lot of sense because obviously whoever wrote Hebrews had a lot of Old Testament knowledge. Knowing that Paul was a Pharisee himself, there's good reason to believe that he would be the one that wrote that. But there are other theories about who may have written the book of Hebrews. But the early church fathers widely accepted it as being authoritative. James. Some of you might know Martin Luther had some issues with the book of James. I think he called it the letter made of straw or something to that effect. Yeah, a little bit. Well, it really, if you're not interpreting it correctly, it can seem like it undercuts the idea that it's faith alone that gets you saved, right? Because of its emphasis on works. Right? Because the book of James really does, faith without works is dead. That's kind of like, one of the battle cries of the book of James. But really, it's not incompatible with Paul's writing. It's more of a clarification on Paul's writing. So what he's saying there is, one of the ways that he kind of portrays it is, show me your faith without works, and I'll show you my faith through my works. Okay, it's through our works that we actually demonstrate that our faith is actually authentic, right? It's if we're not walking the walk, then our talk is just talk, and that's kind of like what James is saying in his epistle. So it was determined that it actually doesn't conflict with Paul's writings, and it was adopted into the canon. 2 Peter is stylistically different than 1 Peter, and there's a number of reasons for this. So does anyone know what's kind of going on with the Peters? Peter used a scribe. And the one that I know definitively he used a scribe, and then second Peter's a little, maybe he used a scribe, but in 1 Peter, he actually mentions his scribe, it's Silvanus.
Do you think that's because Peter's a fisherman and just can't write well?
It's very possible that
Right? No. That makes sense. Peter would have a scribe. He was raised a fisherman, he didn't go to school.
Right, yeah, and I guess John would have too, because John was...
That makes sense.
Yeah, but, right.
Have somebody else write for that makes sense. Anyway, go ahead.
So Silvanus wrote 1 Peter, and we don't know who wrote 2 Peter, so it likely was not Silvanus who wrote it, which would actually explain the difference in style. It was also written at different times, right? There's a lot. The topics were very different. It was written to a different audience, both of them, and so when you look at the context of what's going on between those two letters, it makes a lot of sense that maybe they would have a little bit of a different vocabulary, and they would be about different subjects. And so because of that, they accepted. It was accepted into the canon. 2nd and 3rd John. Remember kind of how I was talking about circulation kind of being an issue, right? So if something wasn't widely circulated, people kind of had doubts about it. Well, 2nd and 3rd John really were not widely circulated at that time. Now, if anyone has read 2nd or 3rd John, very almost informal letters. It almost feels like you're reading like someone's personal letter to someone. And really doctrinally, you're not going to get nearly as much out of 2nd and 3rd John as you're going to get out of something like Romans or 1st, 2nd Corinthians. Like there's just a lot more theologically in those letters. And so you can see how they might have been more circulated than something like 2nd and 3rd John, which were more like personal letters. Not that you can't glean anything out of them. There is doctrinal stuff in there, but you're just going to get a whole lot more.
They're both only 13 verses long.
Right.
I knew they were short, but I couldn't remember how short.
They're very tiny little letters. So you can see why they might not have been as circulated. But it was the circulation aspect that was kind of the reason why people had questions about it. First John was accepted, and First John is notably longer. It's I think 5 chapters. Pretty sure, is it 5 chapters? Yeah, in First John, and there actually is a lot of theological. It's hard theological stuff too in First John. It's rough, but yeah, there's a lot more to be taken out of First John, and I think that's one of the ones that was almost universally accepted from the very beginning. So, and then Jude was another one that was questioned. Let's see, let's talk about that. Jude quotes a non-biblical source. Jude quotes Enoch, okay, which is not a book that's accepted into the Old Testament canon. And so people had were wondering, is this heretical? Because it's referring to the book of Enoch. It was determined, the early church fathers actually never disavowed the book of Jude, so Jude is actually Jesus' brother. So we have James, right, Jesus' brother, and then I believe Jude refers to himself as the brother of James. None of them identify themselves as the brother of Jesus. That's an interesting thing. I think because they don't want to use that as like this trump card of claiming their authority. But he does refer to himself as the brother of James, and we know that James was the brother of the half brother of Jesus. But the early church fathers never said that Jude was something that was not authoritative, and because of that, we feel pretty comfortable in adopting it into our New Testament. And then Revelation actually early on was never rejected. It was accepted accepted as authoritative by the earliest church fathers that we have, and the only reason that it ever came into question was because in the 4th century, meaning the 300s, there were some heretics called the Montanists that tried to tie Revelation to their own doctrines. Right, so they kind of said that there were prophets at this time that had authority, which really there was no evidence of that. But because of this association with the Montanists, people were like, "Is Revelation now bad?" Well, but the early church fathers, the church fathers at the time, came to its defense and said, "No, we've had Revelation this whole time. We don't have to reject it." It's kind of like how Mormons say that the Bible is authoritative to them, even though they're a heretical group, right? Same thing with the JWs or Jehovah's Witnesses do the same thing. Of course, they redact things from Scripture in order to align it with their theology, but they do say that the Bible has authority. And so just because someone's laying claim to the Bible doesn't mean that the whole Bible document is wrong, right? But that's kind of what was going on with Revelation at that time. Any questions? Any of that? No, we're good. Cool. Sometimes winners deserve to win. I'm not sure which. I don't know if that was World Cup or if that was something out in Britain. But I'm not a soccer guy. But they look happy, so I felt like it was a good picture. So the canon only includes writings that were accepted by all or most. And sometimes, just if you have evidence for something, there's a reason why winners deserve to win. If you have evidence for it, there's good reason to believe that it's the most likely truth, right? So what about the losers? All right, so why were books left out of the Bible? So what about the books that were left out of the Bible? Any ideas as to why some of them might have been left out, just based on what we kind of already discussed?
Inconsistencies.
Mm-hmm. Yep. If they theological inconsistency, yep, absolutely. What would be another? Any ideas on like another reason? There's really only one other one, but that I can think off the top of my head, but maybe you guys can think of others. Just flat out wrong, right? Yeah, it completely goes against what was written in the Bible, in the authoritative documents that we know were authentic, right? Yep, that's pretty much it. So only books that were accepted by a few or rejected by all were left out. So let's look at some of the books that were accepted by a few. So we have mostly the writings of the apostolic church fathers. Okay, so this is a little bit of a different category, right? So these would have been, remember how I was talking about like Clement, right? So he was the disciple of Peter, and then we have Ignatius of Antioch and Polycarp, which were disciples of John. So these guys were the earliest church fathers, right? Which were, I guess, once removed from the apostles. And they had certain writings too, right? So we had First and Second Clement, we have the letters of Ignatius, we have the letter of Polycarp, amongst others, that actually never made it into the New Testament canon, right? Because they're not apostolic, right? These are not eyewitness accounts anymore.
Are any of these books, and I can't think of what the word is right now.
Mm-hmm.
You know how the Catholic Bible has that middle part? Are any of
Apocrypha?
That's the word I couldn't forget.
I'd have to, that came up this week, and I meant to look that up. Some of these might actually be, I feel like
Are any of these those books?
First and Second Clement might be in the Apocrypha. I'd have to look closer.
I can't remember. I know.
I meant to look that up before this presentation, and I just totally forgot. So, but that's a good question. I didn't do my job. So, but yeah, some of these might actually be in the Apocrypha. Of course, the Apocrypha are not accepted as being scriptural, right? So, and actually, the Apocrypha, I believe, were put in very late into the Catholic, New Testament and Old Testament, because there's, I think, Maccabees, First and Second Maccabees are in there, which is actually those are Old Testament scriptures. So they've kind of adopted some Old Testament, and I believe you're right. I think there are some New Testament ones in there too that were put in, but this was not accepted.
I thought it was like the middle, like that 400 years between Malachi and Matthew where they stuck that stuff.
That definitely is First and Second Maccabees. I know is
Fits in that.
that fits that one. Now, First and Second Clement wouldn't, because that's after.
It has to be later because of he was alive later.
Right. So that's just I just don't know. So it'd be pretty easy to look up. We just Google, Apocrypha, and I would do it, but then I definitely won't make it to the end of my presentation. But they were greatly valued by Christians, and some even referred to some of these writings as scriptural. But they were ultimately rejected because these are no longer eyewitness accounts. These are no longer accounts that are direct to Jesus, right? So if it's by Jude, right? Half-brother of Jesus. You can't get much closer to Jesus than that. James can't get much closer than the half-brother of Jesus. Obviously, the apostles were walking with him for his earthly ministry and even saw him after he was resurrected. We have Paul, who was exposed, who saw Jesus on the road to Damascus and even had a relationship with him after. So, these apostles had direct connection to Jesus. And so anyone that came after that, sure, their writings could have a lot of value, right? They can help discern, or interpret even some of the apostolic writings if there's some confusion because they knew the apostles, right? And in the same way that today, right, we have a lot of Christian books out today that help us to try to make sense of the Bible and such, but we don't consider that scriptural, right? These are commentaries, and we're not going to say that they're scripture. Same reason that we're not going to accept First and Second Clement, Ignatius, Polycarp, all these other writers as being, authoritative in that way. But they were widely accepted as being of great value at that time. And then we have other books that weren't written by the church fathers that were much less accepted than the church father writing. So you'll have a very few number of people that are going to accept these as with some level of authority. So the Apocalypse of Peter, the Gospel according to the Hebrews, and the Acts of Paul and Thecla would be in that group. But yeah, by and large, no church father was accepting this as having any level of authority, and they were largely rejected, even if they weren't completely rejected. So then we have the ones that were rejected by all, and coincidentally, or ironically, these are the ones that get the most attention out of all of them, which is really silly. But so we have these are obvious forgeries. They were written way too late to be apostolic, or they had teachings that contradicted what was known to be authentic. Right? These are any of these writings that fit into this category. And so this would largely include the Gnostic writings. Okay, there is no evidence that the Gnostic writings existed in the first century. So, and because of that, obviously they cannot be tied to the apostles. Right? And as I said earlier, they don't even try to do that. Actually, they never try to do that. They only say that it's because this was some sort of personal revelation to me, and therefore you should believe me because I had a personal revelation with Jesus, even though there's no evidence for that. And so books that are put into this, Gospel of Thomas. Anyone heard of the Gospel of Thomas? That one is just like in a lot of the psyche among skeptics because it was one that was discovered, I believe in Qumran. Don't quote me on that, but it was discovered in one of these like caves, more recently. And there's like, big revelation. We have the Gospel of Thomas finally, and it says all these things that are obviously not true to biblical teaching, and so they'll use it as kind of like a gotcha to Orthodox Christians, and saying that like, well, look, your whole faith is built on sand. And of course, is that true? Is there any way to actually validate that the Gospel of Thomas is in any way authoritative, or that it came from Thomas, right? Because we have a Gospel of Philip out there, we have a Gospel of Mary, we have a Gospel of Truth, that just sounds Orwellian, and then we have the Gospel of the Egyptians, right? So we have these ones that usually what they would often do, a lot of these writers, these heretical writers or Gnostic writers, is they would try to tie it to someone well-known. Right, so you'll have the Gospel of Peter, you'll have the Gospel of Thomas, or someone that everyone knows to give it a veneer of authority, right? Which actually gives our Gospels that we have some credibility, right? Who knows Mark? No one knows Mark, right? So why would you say that it came from Mark if you're trying to fabricate something as being true? Why would you say it came from Luke? No one knows who Luke is, right? The Church Fathers did. That's how we know that he's a physician and a historian, and through his connection to Paul, right? So Paul does mention him, and yeah, actually, I think he mentions himself a little bit. Well, no, I don't think he names himself by name in Acts, but Paul does refer to him in his letters, right? So you wouldn't do that, though. You would try to claim that it came from someone that everyone knows if you're going to make it, if you're going to try to promote a lie that you knew was a lie. But there were two general criteria that were used to determine if the writings were actually connected to Jesus or the apostles, and these were antiquity and theology. And so we're just going to kind of go through these two methods for determining the truth of a scripture in the next couple slides. So antiquity. So the only Gnostic book that might date to the first century is the Gospel of Thomas. And of course, the main reason why largely, I mean, there's just very little evidence that the Gospel of Thomas was widely circulated at this time. There's just not, all the evidence that we would typically look for all the other books just are absent with the Gospel of Thomas. The main reason, though, is its theology is just way out of line with the rest of the apostles. And so you'd figure if Thomas was really an apostle who was with the other apostles, his theology would not be that distorted or different, right? So
what does it say?
I believe it's more of like a mystical way of attaining salvation. It's more in line with like Gnostic type beliefs, where it's just not simple salvation by grace. I remember it was something back when I used to do yoga, that was a book that people would bring up all the time, which was that it actually aligned better with more mystical teachings of like New Age philosophy than it does. It's something that that's something else I have to do is to actually tease out like what's in the Gospel of Thomas. That would actually be an interesting study for a Sunday school class, is to just like dive into it and compare it to, well, this is what John and Matthew and Mark say, and this is what Thomas says, and to kind of show those differences. But that would be it for another day. So there's three. So there's three scenarios that account for the first century silence of most of these Gnostic writings, okay? Like I said, the only one that might be able to be dated to the first century is the Gospel of Thomas, but the rest of them, there's no way to do that, okay? And so the way that, the reason for the first century silence is rationalized in three different ways, right? So we have that they existed in the first century, but they lost, poof, gone. We don't know where they went. Then they existed in the first century, but they were suppressed, right? So we had, that's the whole power struggle thing that we were talking about earlier, right? So we had someone who was in power, didn't want that to get out, so they crushed the Gospel of Thomas and the rest of it. And then they had that they didn't exist in the first century at all, which makes a lot of sense. Maybe they just didn't exist at all, right? So, so there's no evidence of them being lost or suppressed. It's an argument completely out of silence, right? So Amelia Earhart, where'd she go? No one knows where she went, right? So it's assumed that, in her flight, that she must have crashed somewhere, and she's in the ocean somewhere, and her plane. Actually, did we ever discover her plane? Does anyone know? I don't think we did. Back when I was a kid, I definitely wasn't in existence back then. So we're just gonna go with the premise that we never discovered the plane, because to my knowledge, we never did. But you can make up anything. You could say that she was abducted by aliens, that they did tests on her, right? And no one could say that we definitively know that that's not the case, because we don't know, right? And that's essentially the case that they're making with this whole idea that they were lost or suppressed, right? It's not like we have documentation of them being lost or suppressed. There's no evidence for that. It's just, well, maybe that happened. Well, you can say anything happened, maybe. And so you want to actually look at what do we have evidence for if we're going to try to make the best case for something. So that kind of reasoning just contrasts with the objective basis used by the church fathers to establish our canon, right? It's not an argument made from silence. We actually have very good reasoning between the Muratorian fragment, between the early attestation of the church fathers, between Tertullian, Origen, all those guys that we mentioned earlier that showed that there was actually a progression as to how the New Testament canon was formed, and it wasn't one based on power, right? It was one based on did this definitely come from an apostle or not? I just basically said that. Okay. Theology. So theology was the way. So with the problem with antiquity and proving that something didn't come from an apostle was a very difficult thing to do at this time, right? They didn't have libraries. They didn't have the internet. They didn't have ways to show this succession or this what's called the chain of custody of the different letters, right? To show this this started with John, then it went to Polycarp, and then it went to Irenaeus, and then it went all the way down, right? It was very difficult to do that at that time. I don't even know if that was possible to do that. So the way that they did it was theology, right? So they knew Gospel of John was authentic, right? We know from the church fathers that this definitely came from John himself. And so if something that we're a little unsure of, actually very unsure of, goes against what John says, it's not true, right? And so that's how the church fathers at this time would determine if something was worthy of keeping into the New Testament canon. So the writings that were connected to the apostles were the theological benchmark that they would then use to discredit, teachings that were coming out at the time. And Gnosticism at large just varies greatly with the teachings of the apostles. Another problem with Gnosticism is that there was not a singular Gnostic church, right? So it's not like their theology was consistent. It was all over the place. And so it was very difficult to find out where it came from. There was no way to really tease that out. And then it was also very difficult to discern what was their theology. It just seems random almost at times. Because, you can imagine if someone's just, this is based on my personal revelation, well, everyone's going to have different personal revelation, and there's not going to be much consistency at all. So the non-canonical books were rejected for good reasons, right? Can't claim spiritual authority because they cannot be connected to Jesus or the apostles, and that's the most objective way of determining if something is actually true or not, right? All that makes sense? Cool. Okay, so I think I'm moving faster than normal today. So can we trust the Bible's authors? Anyway, so yeah, it's maybe you'll understand because it's witnesses and he's a detective. Anyone see that movie? Okay, so yeah, he's a detective and it's all about witnesses, and you'll understand why I'm bringing that up. So J. Warner Wallace he's a contemporary author. Who has 4 key questions when assessing eyewitness reliability. Okay, so he's a detective. He was a detective himself before he eventually became more of a prolific Christian writer. And actually, his primary book is called Cold Case Christianity. And what he does in that book is he goes through the Gospels themselves, or the Gospels particularly, and determines whether or not they match up, or whether they can be considered authentic eyewitness accounts. Right, and his means of doing that is he looks at were they present, right? So we can pretend that he's looking at Matthew as though he were looking at a witness to a crime, okay? And he's asking Matthew, was he present for the events that he's recording? Was his account corroborated by someone else like Mark, Luke, or John? Right, so is there some connection going on, or do they fill in gaps with each other? Like you would with multiple eyewitnesses, right? Because no one eyewitness has the whole story. And you kind of take all of them together to try to figure out the whole thing. And so he's kind of looking at the 4 Gospels to see, do they corroborate each other? Were they accurate, right? So do they actually say what actually happened at the time? And were they biased, right? So that's another thing that you have to consider. So does someone have something to be gained by saying something, right? Or not, or lost, right? And when you take all those together, it kind of helps build the case as to whether or not this actually was an authentic eyewitness who's telling the truth. So let's look at this. So were they present? Were the gospel writers present for what happened? When they record Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. So no one in antiquity attributes the 4 Gospels to anyone other than the four writers, right? So no one attributes it. Those church fathers never said Matthew came from someone else. They never said John came from someone else. They were very consistent on that. And so because of that, because they would have been able to know that, because you couldn't get any closer in proximity to those 4 writers, we have every reason to believe them. We have no reason to think that they were telling a lie. Yeah, and the church fathers clarify the gospel authorship, right? So I think I said this earlier, right? So they were the ones that, I kind of just said this anyway. That's how we know that Mark was the author of Peter's account. That's how we know that Luke compiled the accounts of the rest of the disciples and Paul. And then there's good reasons to believe that the Gospels were written in the first century. And some of these evidences are just really cool. So just, if you remember them, great, but maybe even look them up later on. But a major event that happened in the first century that's nowhere recorded in the Gospels or any of our letters is the destruction of the temple, right? That's actually a big event that we know today. It's just a huge event in antiquity. And you would imagine, especially in Acts, right, when they're recording everything that happened, during the times of the apostles when they're preaching the gospel out to the nations, if the temple had been destroyed, that would have been in Acts. You're not going to leave that major detail out. And there's certain other details that they left out too that would also have been in Acts. And really those three events are the deaths of certain apostles, which Paul, right? Paul's not dead at the end of Acts. Neither is Peter, and neither is James, the brother of Jesus. All of them are, as far as we can tell, still alive. And those because we know that Stephen was martyred, right? So if we're going to record the death of Stephen, who was not even an apostle, and we have that James, the son of Zebedee, was also killed as well. If we have those two deaths, why wouldn't we have the death of Peter? He was one of the most notable ones of them all, and same thing with Paul. And even James, who became the leader of the church in Jerusalem. These are major figures that we're leaving out, but we know that their deaths occurred much later than those other two. So Stephen died in the 30s, right? And then we have James dying in the 40s. The earliest of the three that I mentioned would have been James, who would have died in 62 AD. And so for that reason, most historians don't date any of the Gospels or even Acts until before 62 AD because of that, because they didn't mention the death of James. Right? So we have this, because of that, we just have very good reason to believe in the early dating. Any questions on that? That kind of makes sense? Jive, sort of, maybe? Cool. All right, so were they corroborated, right? So, is there kind of that inter-gospel connection going on? And that would be independent evidence. Corroboration just basically means independent evidence that's supported by claims. And what I was kind of more talking about was internal corroboration, right? So internal corroboration is where you have details in Matthew that are kind of left unexplained that other gospels kind of pick up and explain, right? And the coolest one, which I can't get into because there's a lot of, it's just dense, there's a lot going on, is the feeding of the 5,000. If you ever have a chance to read Cold Case Christianity, he goes really into detail on how all four gospels give us different details on that event. But the one that I will tell you, which is a little shorter, is also pretty cool. So in Matthew 8:14, after Jesus heals Peter's mother-in-law, it says that people went to be healed by Jesus that evening. Okay, sounds like a pretty straightforward statement. Nothing. I wouldn't have picked up on this, but J. Warner Wallace looks at this and goes, "Why evening? Why not go in the day? Why? And it's a question. And actually, Mark and Luke's account tell us why, because it was the day of the Sabbath. Okay, and that was a major no-no to be healed during the Sabbath time. No works. You couldn't do any kind of work at that time. And of course, Jesus had his own feelings on that, so I'm sure he would have healed them. But them being Jews didn't want to do that. So that's kind of internal corroboration. That kind of you have details from certain accounts that fill in the gaps with other accounts. Then we have external corroboration. So for those of you that were here. Still doing okay. These are extra-biblical accounts. So these are not in the New Testament. These are not testamental writings that show that kind of fill in the gap, or actually more just kind of validate what's going on in the Gospels. So we kind of talked about Thallus a few weeks ago. For those of you that were here, so Thallus was someone who was writing in the 50s AD, and he was not a Christian. Basically what he did is he was talking about the darkness that happened during Jesus' crucifixion, right? And he tried to explain it away, saying that it was a solar eclipse, right? That it wasn't actually, a supernatural event. It was just a solar eclipse. But what that does is it tells us there was darkness at the time of Jesus' crucifixion. So we have external corroboration. That's what that is, right? So writings that are outside of the Bible saying that something that happened inside the Bible is actually true. So. And then were they biased? So we're skipping over were they accurate for a second because we're going to come back to that. So skeptic authors, this is the claim of skeptics, is that authors were biased and therefore unreliable. So let's kind of discuss that a little bit. So I believe this was, I can't remember if this was last class or the one before it, but the disciples were not biased towards Jesus during his life, right? So they were trying to figure out who Jesus was. And we have Philip kind of questioning him like, Lord, if you are, show me the Father and I will believe, or, something like that. And Jesus kind of shoots back to him, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. So they're kind of missing the boat on certain things. When Jesus tells them about that he's going to have to be betrayed and killed, at the hands of the Sanhedrin, and Peter says, far be it from me, Lord, never let this happen. And, Jesus says, get away from me, Satan. He's not understanding why Jesus came, right? That this had to happen. So there were certain things that they weren't getting, and they didn't really understand who he was at this time. So they couldn't have really been biased in that way towards him. But then we have after his death, right? So it's a completely different thing. They're boldly proclaiming the gospel. They're no longer afraid, because that was another big thing before Jesus went to the cross, right? They all fled. Right? They were not willing to be tried at that time, but of course they were very willing to be tried after his resurrection. Really, for me, this idea of being this idea of bias being the big thing that proves that the apostles were wrong is making this mistake called the genetic fallacy. And what the genetic fallacy is using a source to discredit something. For example, the Holocaust was largely chronicled by Jews, right? And so what people will, basically what you'd have to argue if you're going to use the genetic fallacy is that because it was chronicled by Jews, there's no way to know if the Holocaust happened. And of course, that's ridiculous, right? So we have evidence that the Holocaust did happen, and we're basing our knowledge on that information. And which is the same approach that we should have with the apostles, right? So just because they're Christians, they're believers in Jesus, doesn't mean that their message was necessarily false. You'd want to verify that through other means. And J. Warner Wallace has three motives that drive dishonesty, right? Money, sexual desire, and power, okay? And just the apostles didn't have any of this, right? So the apostles were, in 1 Corinthians 4:11, it says that to this present hour, we hunger and thirst, we're poorly dressed and buffeted and homeless. They never got monetary gain out of preaching the gospel, right? So we know that. Sexual desire, that's an argument made of silence. We know that Peter was married. In fact, in 1 Corinthians 9, Paul even says that some of the other ones may have been married, but even if they weren't, we have no evidence that they actually gained in that way at all, okay? And actually, the last one really shoots that down, I think. So power, they certainly didn't get. They were all martyred for what they believed. And because of that, if they were willing to be martyred, I don't think relational gain was their driving force. There was something much stronger than that, which is their conviction that this actually was true, right? So, is the Bible accurate? Let's see if I can fly through this. So there's no original text that have survived the present day. So we have copies of copies of copies, right? And so people will say that because there's copies, how can we know? And they'll base that on certain things. So, and of course, the copies at that time were copied by hand. I think most of you probably know that. We didn't have printing presses back then, which could, accurately reproduce them. And because of that, there are thousands of differences amongst these copies. So we have 20,000 plus copies that exist with thousands of differences, from antiquity, right? I think dating up to before 1000 AD. We have 20,000 different versions of this. And the skeptic conclusion, because there's all these differences in there, is that we have no idea what was originally written. And so we're just going to briefly discuss textual criticism. So this is a discipline that studies copies to find out what the original said. And the way that this works is, say in the original you have cats and dogs, and then it becomes bats and dogs, and then it becomes bats and hogs, right? So it just kind of depreciates over time. Maybe if like one copy, say copies bats and dogs instead of cats and dogs, and then that gets copied, and then 1 out of the 10 of those says bats and hogs. You can see how it just kind of gets, worse over time. So, but it also considers complex factors like dating. So was this from the 1st century? Was this from the 9th century? Generally, the closer you get, the more likely it is to be authentic. And then geographic origin. Did it come from, Jerusalem, or did it come from Rome? And it takes those factors into account. So textual variant is any place where there's a variation in wording, right? So the New Testament has 140,000 words, and there are between 300,000 to 400,000 variants of the New Testament. And that can sound really bad for our case, but we want to know what goes into those variants, what mostly makes them up. And the reason for the large number of variants is because of the large number of manuscripts, right? So if we only had one New Testament, how many variants would we have? 0, right? And so it's actually the fact that we have so many to compare that actually all these variants exist, and it actually helps us to understand which one is true, right? Because obviously if we only have one New Testament, who knows? Maybe it's true, maybe it's a complete fabrication. We don't know. But if we have all these different ones, we can compare them and try to discern which one's the true one. Yep, so more manuscripts equals more reliability, and these are just the different languages that the manuscripts are in. Just for fun, we only have 210 copies of Plato's work compared to 20,000. So, So certain other ones, and no one doubts Plato, but everyone doubts the New Testament. So, yeah. I think it's a little bigger. It's like 1,700 or something, but still, compared to 20,000, it pales in comparison. Most of them. What's that?
It's a crazy big number to think that from 2,000 years ago, there's 20,000 manuscripts of basically the same thing.
I know. When I found that detail out, it blew my mind. And I'm like, and people are so quick to discredit, the New Testament. And I think most of them don't even know that detail. So it's just a fun little thing to keep in your mind. So, but most of them are spelling differences. So, think of like the word color, C-O-L-O-R versus C-O-L-O-U-R. That's a variant. Okay, so they'll consider that a variant, and most of them are that. Or they're not even real differences. It's
which is dialect or who you studied from or
right. Yeah.
You didn't put a comma in the right place.
Yes. Stuff like that. And that is that's the vast majority of the variants. But there's some other ones. These are minor differences, right, that don't affect translation. So saying fisherman instead of man who fished, okay, still, like it does not affect translation at all. This is just a slight change in wording. Then there's differences that affect the meaning but aren't viable, right? So these could be, you have one variant that says that Peter was a shepherd, right? But say it was written in the 9th century. And the other 19,000 said that he was a fisherman, right? You're obviously going to say, well, the one who said he was a shepherd is probably wrong. But then there's some that do affect the meaning and are viable, meaning we have to consider them because multiple variants or multiple manuscripts say both. And so we have to kind of compare them. And you guys might know about this. Don't have a crisis of faith. Okay? So the woman caught in adultery in John 7 and 8 is not in the earliest manuscripts. So we actually... Certain pastors will not preach that account of the woman that the Pharisees accused and they're asking Jesus should we stone her, and Jesus writes in the sand and that whole thing, and then he eventually says where have your accusers gone, because they didn't throw any stones at her. So that actually is not in the earliest manuscripts, and so because of that maybe we should redact it. It's still in there, and actually it flies around in like. I think it's in some manuscripts. It's actually in the Gospel of Luke. But it came out much later. It's just not in the earliest ones. But the question is, if we remove this account of the adulterous woman, does it affect the core doctrines? Is Jesus no longer God? Does God no longer exist? Did the resurrection no longer happen? Is the gospel null and void? Like, it doesn't do any of that, right? And so because of that. We can comfortably, take out the adulterous woman and not have to worry about the authenticity of our belief. Same thing with the end of Mark's gospel. So the end of Mark, verses 9 through 20, are not in the earliest manuscripts, and they actually do kind of say some interesting things. So really, where it ends is the women fleeing after they see the angel, and the angel tells them that Jesus was raised from the dead and he's no longer here, and go tell the disciples about it, and they just kind of run away. But where it kind of keeps going after that, and it says that Jesus reprimands the disciples for not believing the women, for telling them about him. He tells them to preach the gospel to all creation, so it kind of is like another great commission. And he tells them, and this is kind of where I think like some Pentecostal beliefs come from, that those who believe will be able to cast out demons, that they'll be able to speak in tongues, and they'll pick up serpents, and they'll be unharmed by poison. Okay, so. If you take that out, it doesn't affect anything, right? It's and actually it differs in some degree from traditional teachings. I don't think disciples will unanimously be able to speak in tongues or pick up serpents. So if we redact that part, it doesn't affect the gospel, right? Jesus is still God, the resurrection still happened, all that. So, okay, was a race to the end, but I think I made it. Okay, so we can all pick up our kids now, and so, all right. But any questions? Feel free to. I love talking about this stuff, and if there's anything that I didn't address, I'd be happy to look it up. There's just a ton of information out there, and there's only so much I can fit into a single class. And in fact, I went over a little bit, like I always do. So, but thanks for coming.
Don't answer my